You're so fluffy. So fluffy. You're so fluffy. Hello and welcome back. Today I will be going over some beginner hand sewing techniques. Now these techniques are used in sewing quite more often than you probably would think they are, especially if you're doing draping or if you need to like fix a seam on a garment. These come in quite handy, and sometimes it's just easier to hand stitch something than to put it under a machine, because sometimes it can get complicated and difficult, and it's always nice to know these few basic hand stitches to really help you when you're in a pinch. Before I get started, I do want to say that I have a little printout notebook on my website for you. It is free of charge, and you can print it out, and it is just a little hand sewing guide. It'll have a little more in depth about these stitches, and I'll have a few more stitches for your personal use. It'll include some hand done finishing seams as well, in case you don't have a serger, or if you don't want to finish your or if you want to finish your seams by hand. There will be some extra stitches in that little notebook, so be sure to check it out in the link in the description below if you want that little mini handbook for you. Now of course there's just the basic hand stitch, and that's just used for sewing fabric together, just like if you had a regular sewing machine. It's the same thing. Typically you want to get your stitches as close together as possible when you're hand stitching, because it'll help keep it stronger than if you were to do them bigger. The first one I want to show you is the back stitch, and this is a simple stitch. It was used a lot when sewing machines weren't a thing, so it is a strong stitch that's really going to help keep your fabric together, and you won't have to worry about it falling apart or ripping. So this is a very useful stitch to know, especially if you need to stitch something by hand because you don't have access to a machine or something, but you also need it to stay in place and you need it to be strong. So this is a great stitch to use for that, and it is rather simple. All you're going to do is you are going to take your needle, stick it in the fabric of course, and then when you bring it out, you're going to back about halfway in between your previous stitch, and then you're going to do the same thing and go forward where your halfway mark would be for your next stitch. The next one is the blind hem stitch. Now this actually, there's a machine that does this, and you can get like feet for your sewing machine that does this, but honestly the sewing machine feet that you get for a blind hem, they aren't really blind, like you can still see it. So I prefer to do it by hand because I don't have a blind hem machine. So this is a very simple, it's not as hard as you would think. It is a very easy technique to use. So it involves either using a tunnel, so you would have to have fabric folded over and laying flat against each other, and you're going to put your needle in between the tunnel, and then you're going to barely grab the fabric on the other end, and that is what keeps it, well, blind, so you can't see it. This is a strong stitch used for hemming, mainly like if you had slacks or a special evening gown. This is really what that's used for when you don't want to see the hem of your garment. The next one is of course sewing on a button. This is really important because you cannot sew a button on using a machine. There are some machines that'll sew a button on if it has like the 2 holes, but most machines don't have that function, so you really do need to know how to sew on a button properly and strongly so it doesn't like pop off. So this is an important stitch of course to know, and there are several ways to do it, and I will be going over them right now. So to start the buttonhole stitch, you're going to put the thread into the fabric, and you're going to pull it out and loop it so you have a nice strong stitch there. And the key to doing a buttonhole stitch is that you want to try and keep your needle in the exact same spot every single time. Obviously that might not happen, but you want to try and keep these stitches as close together as possible. And you're just going to wrap it in between your holes and continue on doing this. Now if you have a 4-hole button, it's the same process, and you can choose how to put on the button, whether you want to do the cross across each hole, or you want to do parallel. So it's really up to you when you're doing those buttons. And then the buttons that have the little loop on the back are done the same way as well. It just may be a little more complicated, and I do recommend putting either a toothpick or a small pencil between the button and the fabric, because it's not flat. The button needs to be able to fit around another piece of fabric, and depending how thick that fabric is, if you sew the button directly to your fabric, you might not have enough space in between the button and the fabric to actually button up what you need to button up. So make sure you stick a toothpick or a small pencil in between the button and your fabric when you're sewing it together, so you have plenty of room to actually button up your clothing. This next stitch has to do with the buttonhole. It is actually sometimes referred as the buttonhole stitch, but I'm going to call it the blanket stitch just because this video I already previously said buttonhole. So we're going to call it the blanket stitch, which is the other name for it. And this is actually the stitch you use if you need to do a buttonhole by hand. So if your buttonhole broke or if it's coming apart on your clothing, redoing your buttonhole on a machine might be difficult, and it might just be easier to do it by hand. So this is the stitch you're going to use for it. It's rather simple, and it involves sewing on the ends of your fabric, of course, because your buttonhole is going to be open. And you're going to loop it continuously around, and you can do this as many times as you feel like it's needed to keep your fabric from unraveling. And the last stitch I'm going to go over is a basting stitch. Now you can do a basting stitch with your machine. You would want to put your machine to the longest stitch length, and you would not want to back stitch on your machine, but you can baste by hand, which for some applications I think is better. It's just easier to get to, like if you're basting your sleeves to your garment before you actually sew them. I would suggest doing it by hand because, one, you're basting it so the fabric stays in place in the first part, and putting it under a machine might not work as well. So I really do suggest basting for sleeves. And as well, basting is a temporary stitch, and a lot of times people don't do a lot of hand stitching, so basting comes very naturally to a lot of people, and it does take a little bit more time than if you were just to baste with your machine. However, it'll be much easier to take out this basting stitch if you do it by hand. Even if you turn your machine to the longest stitch length, doing a baste by hand will be much easier to pull out because you don't have two threads in there. You have one. All you have to do is pull it, and especially if you keep the stitch length longer, it will be extremely easy to take out that stitch. So thank you so much for watching this video. Please give this video a thumbs up if you liked it. Please subscribe to my channel for more content on fashion and sewing, and I can't wait to see you guys in my next video. I will see you all later. Yeah, I thought that I was gonna say something more, and then my brain just cut out. So I'm sure y'all have been through that. It's cutting out again. All right, goodbye.